The fluorescent lights of Atlanta's Municipal Court flickered to life as Judge Marcus Henderson straightened his black robe, rehearsing the day's first session in his mind. At 63, he'd spent 2 decades on this bench, pride swelling in his chest at his reputation for running the tightest ship in Georgia. His meticulously arranged desk, perfectly aligned gavel, and strict 9 a.m. start time were legendary. Time was respect, and respect was everything. Through the frosted glass of his chamber door, he watched the usual morning crowd filter in, faces he'd seen 1,000 times before, mostly white professionals in crisp suits clutching their traffic citations. But today, something felt different. Perhaps it was the gathering storm clouds outside or the way his clerk kept glancing nervously at the clock. What he couldn't know, was that in exactly 17 minutes, a woman in an understated navy blazer would walk through those heavy oak doors and shatter every assumption he built his career upon. The clock struck at 9 a.m. "All rise," the bailiff called out. At precisely 9:17 a.m., Alexandra Washington pushed through the courtroom doors, her navy blazer slightly damp from the morning drizzle. She moved with quiet confidence, but her arrival immediately drew Judge Henderson's attention. His pale blue eyes narrowed over his reading glasses, and his jaw tightened at the interruption. "Approach," he commanded, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the courtroom. The young white man whose traffic violation he'd been reviewing seemed forgotten as Alexandra made her way to the podium. She carried a slim leather portfolio, her natural hair styled professionally, and gold earrings catching the fluorescent light. "Your name?" Judge Henderson's tone carried that particular edge Alexandra had learned to recognize over her 15 years in law. That subtle note of condescension reserved for certain defendants. "Alexandra Washington, Your Honor." Her voice was steady and measured. "Ms. Washington," he emphasized the MS, with barely concealed disdain. "Your case was scheduled for 9 a.m. Do you see that clock?" He pointed to the wall with his reading glasses. "It clearly shows 9:17. In this courtroom, we value punctuality." 2 rows back, a white businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch, remembering his late arrival at 9:12, which had gone completely unremarked upon. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Patterson, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Alexandra began, but Judge Henderson raised his hand. "What we have here," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, "is a clear disregard for this court's time and procedures." He shuffled through his papers with exaggerated care. "A simple parking violation, was it? Well, it seems we need to add contempt of court to today's discussion." The morning sun broke through the storm clouds outside, sending harsh rays through the high windows that seemed to spotlight Alexandra at the podium. She stood perfectly still, her right hand resting on her portfolio, watching as Judge Henderson prepared to demonstrate exactly the kind of systemic bias she'd spent her career fighting. "This court hereby fines you $500 for contempt," he announced, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Perhaps that will serve as a reminder that tardiness has consequences." He paused, clearly expecting her to wilt under his authority. "Do you understand?" What Judge Henderson didn't realize, as he sat in his elevated position of power, was that Alexandra Washington understood far more than he could imagine. And in about 30 seconds, so would he. Alexandra's phone vibrated silently in her blazer pocket, likely another urgent message about the Martinez trafficking case she'd been forced to handle remotely this morning. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the scene unfolding before her. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the importance of documenting every detail. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied evenly, her tone revealing nothing. "I understand completely." She reached for her phone, appearing to check her banking app for the fine payment. Instead, her fingers quickly typed out a time-stamped note of everything that had transpired in the last 10 minutes. Judge Henderson's satisfaction was palpable as he adjusted his reading glasses, preparing to move on to the next case. "You'll need to pay that fine before leaving the building today, Ms. Washington. The clerk's office closes at 4. He emphasized the time pointedly, drawing a few nervous chuckles from the gallery. "Your Honor," Alexandra's voice cut through the murmurs. "I'd like to address several concerning aspects of these proceedings." She opened her portfolio with deliberate slowness. "First, I noticed that Mr. James Davidson, who arrived at 9:12 today, received no comment about his tardiness." The businessman in the expensive suit suddenly found the floor intensely interesting. Judge Henderson's face flushed. "Ms. Washington, you are in no position." "Second," she continued professionally, "I've observed that of the 7 people who entered this courtroom after 9 a.m., only the 3 people of color received any reprimand. And third," she pulled out her phone again, "I've been documenting a pattern of discriminatory treatment since I entered this courtroom." "That's enough." Judge Henderson's gavel crashed down. "One more word and I'll double the fine for contempt." Mrs. Patterson, the elderly clerk, had stopped typing entirely. In her 30 years serving this court, she'd never seen anyone stand up to Judge Henderson like this. Her arthritis-curved fingers reached for her notebook, where she'd been keeping her record of the judge's patterns of behavior for years. "Your Honor," Alexandra's voice remained steady, "threatening additional punitive measures for pointing out discriminatory treatment only compounds the issue at hand." She paused, allowing her words to settle over the now silent courtroom. "Would you like me to elaborate on the statistical disparities I've observed in your sentencing patterns this morning?" The bailiff, Officer Marcus Thompson, shifted his weight uncomfortably. As a black man who'd served in this courtroom for 8 years, he'd witnessed countless similar scenarios. But something about this morning felt different, like a long-awaited storm was finally breaking. Judge Henderson's face had progressed from red to purple. "Ms. Washington, your behavior is completely unacceptable. This is a court of law, not a social justice seminar. I'm doubling the fine to $1,000, and if you continue this disruptive behavior, I'll have you removed from my courtroom." Alexandra calmly pulled out her phone again, adding to her notes. The morning sun had fully emerged from the storm clouds now, streaming through the high windows and illuminating the tension-filled scene. A law student in the back row frantically scribbled notes, sensing she was witnessing something historic. "For the record, Your Honor," Alexandra spoke, ensuring every word was captured by the court reporter. "You've now escalated punitive measures in direct response to the identification of potentially discriminatory practices. I'd like to note the time of this escalation for my report." The gallery had become still. Even the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Every eye moved between the increasingly agitated judge and the remarkably composed woman at the podium. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his knuckles white against the wooden bench. "Report? What report? Who exactly do you think you are?" "That's an excellent question, Your Honor." Alexandra reached into her portfolio once more. "But before I answer, I'd like to ensure my documentation is complete. Would you please confirm the total fine amount for the record? Is it now $1,000 for being 17 minutes late to a parking ticket hearing?" The judge's voice shook with barely contained rage. "The fine stands at $1,000, and I'm adding $500 for your continued contempt of this court. Perhaps spending some time in a holding cell will help you understand the seriousness of your situation." Alexandra nodded, adding this latest development to her notes. Her phone buzzed again. The Martinez case wouldn't wait much longer. She'd hoped to handle this situation with more subtlety, but Judge Henderson's escalating behavior left her no choice. The time had come to end this particular performance. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that made several attorneys in the gallery sit up straighter, "I believe we've gathered sufficient evidence of discriminatory practices for one morning." She pulled out her Department of Justice credentials, the gold badge catching the sunlight. "I should introduce myself properly. I'm Alexandra Washington, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, currently lead prosecutor on the Martinez human trafficking case, which is, incidentally, the reason for my delayed arrival this morning." The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and electric. Judge Henderson's face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Mrs. Patterson dropped her pen, which clattered loudly in the pristine silence. The law student in the back gasped. I've been investigating reports of systemic bias in municipal courts, Alexandra continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. But I never expected to experience such a clear demonstration firsthand. Your Honor, would you like to revisit any of your rulings from the past 10 minutes? Or should we proceed directly to the formal review process? The morning sun seemed to spotlight Judge Henderson now, harsh and unforgiving, as he faced the consequences of his actions. In trying to make an example of Alexandra Washington, he had instead made an example of himself, and the very system he represented was about to face a reckoning long overdue. Judge Marcus Henderson's path to the bench had been paved with privilege and tradition. A third-generation graduate of Emory Law School, he'd followed his father and grandfather's footsteps into the judiciary, inheriting not just their professional connections but their deeply ingrained biases. In 20 years on the bench, he'd developed a reputation for running what he called an orderly courtroom, what others might call a system of subtle but persistent discrimination. His background had been carefully curated: prestigious private schools, exclusive country clubs, and social circles that remained stubbornly homogeneous despite Atlanta's diverse population. He never had to question his assumptions about authority, justice, or who deserved the benefit of the doubt. His marriage to the daughter of another prominent judge had only reinforced his position within Atlanta's old guard legal establishment. Alexandra Washington's journey couldn't have been more different. The daughter of a civil rights attorney and a public school teacher, she'd grown up hearing stories about the ongoing struggle for equality in the justice system. Her father had fought discriminatory practices in Georgia's courts for 30 years, coming home each night with new stories of injustice and new strategies for fighting it. Her mother had taught her that education was both a shield and a sword in the battle for civil rights. At Howard Law School, Alexandra distinguished herself not just through academic excellence but through her dedication to systemic change. She'd spent her summers interning with civil rights organizations, documenting patterns of discrimination in the court system. Her thesis on implicit bias in judicial decision-making caught the attention of the Department of Justice, leading to her current role as a federal prosecutor. The Martinez case she was handling today represented everything she fought for: a complex human trafficking investigation that crossed racial and economic lines, demanding equal justice regardless of background. She'd spent months building the case, working late into the night, knowing that every detail mattered when challenging deeply entrenched systems of power. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, had her history with Judge Henderson's courtroom. Over 3 decades, she'd witnessed the subtle ways justice bent differently for different people. She'd started keeping her private notebook of incidents 15 years ago, after watching a young black attorney get held in contempt for the same minor procedural mistake a white colleague had made without consequence the day before. Her small act of rebellion, documenting every instance of unequal treatment, had been her way of bearing witness, though she never found the courage to speak up. Officer Marcus Thompson, the bailiff, carried his burden of silent observation. His position required him to maintain order in a system he increasingly recognized as disordered at its core. Every day, he watched the patterns play out. White defendants received more time to explain their situations, more benefit of the doubt, and more leniency in sentencing. He'd learned to keep his face neutral, but his mind catalogued every instance of disparity. The young law student furiously taking notes in the back row was named Sarah Chin. Her presence today wasn't accidental. She'd been assigned to observe municipal court proceedings for her civil rights law seminar. Her professor had told the class to watch for subtle signs of systemic bias, but nothing in her textbooks had prepared her for witnessing such a clear demonstration of both the problem and the potential for change. The entire courtroom represented a microcosm of Atlanta's justice system: the old guard clinging to power and privilege, the silent witnesses who documented injustice without the power to challenge it, and the new generation of legal professionals determined to create change from within. The tension between tradition and transformation, between institutional bias and equal justice, had been building for years. Now, as Alexandra Washington stood at the podium with her federal credentials displayed, these various histories converged into a single moment of reckoning. Her preparation for this confrontation hadn't begun this morning, It had roots in her childhood dinner table discussions, her law school research, and countless hours spent building cases that challenged systemic inequality. Judge Henderson's discriminatory treatment hadn't created this situation, it had simply provided the catalyst for exposing patterns that had existed for decades. Judge Henderson's recovery from the initial shock of Alexandra's revelation was swift and defensive. His face regained its color, flushing with a different kind of anger now, the desperate rage of privilege challenged. He shuffled papers on his bench, buying time, attempting to reassert control over his rapidly derailing courtroom. "Federal credentials notwithstanding, Ms. Washington," he said, emphasizing her civilian title again. "This is still my courtroom. Your position doesn't exempt you from basic rules of conduct and respect for this court's authority." His voice carried a slight tremor beneath its attempted authority. Alexandra maintained her composed stance at the podium, but her eyes tracked every movement, every micro-expression crossing the judge's face. Her phone buzzed again, the Martinez case demanding attention, but she knew this moment required her complete focus. Sometimes justice needed to be delayed in one case to be served in a broader context. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice carrying that precise tone that had made her legendary in federal court. "Let's review the events of the last 30 minutes in detail." She opened her leather portfolio again, drawing out a slim tablet. "Would you prefer to discuss the statistical pattern of discriminatory fines first, or shall we address the retaliatory escalation of penalties when bias was identified?" The gallery had transformed into an audience holding its collective breath. The law student, Sarah Chin, had abandoned her notebook, instead recording every word on her phone. Mrs. Patterson's arthritic fingers flew across her keyboard, determined to capture this historic moment in its entirety. Judge Henderson's hand tightened on his gavel. "This is highly irregular and inappropriate. If you have concerns about this court's conduct, there are proper channels." "Indeed there is, Your Honor," Alexandra interrupted smoothly. "I'm employing them now." She gestured to her phone. "My office has already received my initial report, including timestamped documentation of discriminatory treatment observed in your courtroom this morning. Would you like me to read it for the record?" The bailiff, Officer Thompson, shifted his position slightly, moving closer to the center of the courtroom. In 8 years, he'd never seen Judge Henderson's authority so directly challenged. The judge's reputation for retribution against those who questioned his decisions was well known among court staff. "This is outrageous," Judge Henderson sputtered, his judicial demeanor cracking. "I've served on this bench for 20 years. My record—" "Your record is precisely what concerns us, Your Honor." Alexandra's voice cut through his protests like a laser. She turned to face the gallery. "Mr. Davidson, would you be willing to confirm the time of your arrival this morning? And perhaps share what, if any, penalties were assessed for your tardiness?" The businessman in his expensive suit looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "I arrived at 9:12, he admitted, his voice barely carrying across the silent courtroom. "There was no penalty." Judge Henderson's gavel crashed down. "That's enough. This court is in recess. Ms. Washington, my chambers, now." "I believe," Alexandra replied calmly. "Any further discussion should include representatives from the Judicial Qualifications Commission. I took the liberty of contacting them when your discriminatory pattern became clear." She checked her watch. "They should be arriving shortly." The judge's face went from red to white in an instant. The mention of the JQC, the one body with real power over his position, hit him like a physical blow. His hand trembled slightly as he set down his gavel. Mrs. Patterson chose this moment to stand slowly from her desk, her notebook clutched to her chest. "Your Honor," her voice quavered but grew stronger with each word. "I have records. 15 years of records. Every fine, every disparity, every incident." She turned to Alexandra. "I've been keeping them, waiting for someone who could do something." The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. Officer Thompson stepped forward as well. "I can confirm Mrs. Patterson's observations and add my own. 8 years of witnessed discriminatory treatment, documented in my daily reports." Judge Henderson's world was unraveling thread by thread. He looked desperately around the courtroom, seeking any friendly face, any ally, but found only turned heads or accusing stares. The morning sun, now high in the sky, streamed through the windows like a spotlight on his bench, illuminating every bead of sweat on his forehead. "This is a conspiracy," he managed, his voice hollow. "A coordinated attack on this court's integrity. I won't stand for what you're witnessing, Your Honor," Alexandra interrupted, her voice carrying an almost gentle tone now. "Isn't a conspiracy. It's accountability." She took a step closer to the bench. "And you have a choice to make in the next few moments. One that will determine not just the outcome of this morning's events, but the legacy of your entire judicial career." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Two individuals in formal business attire entered, carrying briefcases marked with the Judicial Qualifications Commission seal. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Judge Henderson sat rigid in his chair, his authority evaporating like morning dew under the harsh sun of scrutiny. The next words spoken in this courtroom would either begin a process of genuine reform or cement his place in history as another example of power's inability to police itself. Alexandra Washington stood steady at the podium, prepared for either outcome. The JQC representatives approached the bench with measured steps, their presence transforming the municipal courtroom into something far more consequential. The woman in the lead, Director Sandra Marshall, was well known in legal circles for her unflinching pursuit of judicial accountability. "Your Honor," Director Marshall addressed Judge Henderson, her voice carrying decades of authority. "We're here in response to some very serious allegations." She turned to Alexandra. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Washington, I understand you have documentation to share?" Alexandra nodded, but before she could respond, Judge Henderson made one final attempt to salvage his position. "This is all a misunderstanding," he declared, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "A simple matter of courtroom discipline blown out of proportion by your actions, Your Honor," Alexandra interjected smoothly. She held up her phone, now connected to the courtroom's audio system. "Shall we review the recording of this morning's proceedings? Your different treatment of Mr. Davidson's tardiness compared to mine? The escalating fines in response to legitimate concerns? Or perhaps," she paused, letting the moment hang, "we should discuss the statistical analysis my office has compiled of your sentencing patterns over the past 5 years? The color drained from Judge Henderson's face. 5 years? The Department of Justice has been investigating patterns of discriminatory practices in municipal courts throughout the state," Alexandra revealed, her voice steady. "What we witnessed today isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a systemic pattern that ends now." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her notebook trembling in her hands. "I have dates, times, specific instances," she offered. 15 years of records showing differential treatment based on race, gender, and perceived status. The revelation hit Judge Henderson like a physical blow. His carefully constructed world of absolute authority crumbled as he realized that every discriminatory decision, every biased ruling, and every moment of unchecked privilege had been noted, documented, and was now coming to light. He began, but for the first time in 20 years on the bench, words failed him. Director Marshall opened her briefcase, removing a formal document. "Judge Henderson, in light of the evidence presented and the seriousness of these allegations, you have a choice. You can either step down voluntarily, pending a full investigation, or face an immediate suspension and public hearing." The morning sun had reached its zenith, flooding the courtroom with unforgiving light. The gallery sat in absolute silence, witnessing justice being served not through force or violence, but through the patient, persistent documentation of truth. Sarah Chin, the law student, would later write in her civil rights law journal. "At that moment, we witnessed not just the exposure of one judge's bias, but the beginning of a fundamental shift in how justice is administered. It wasn't just about who held power, but how that power was used, and most importantly, how it could be held accountable." Judge Henderson looked down at his hands, then at the gavel he'd wielded so carelessly for so many years. With trembling fingers, he reached for the document Director Marshall held out. "I'll step down," he whispered, then cleared his throat and repeated more firmly, "I'll step down." Alexandra Washington stood at the podium, her federal credentials still gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol not just of her authority but of the change one person could initiate when armed with truth, determination, and unwavering dedication to justice. Within hours of Judge Henderson's resignation, the ripples of change began spreading through Atlanta's judicial system. The courthouse buzzed with activity as news traveled from courtroom to courtroom, office to office, transforming decades of whispered concerns into open discussions about accountability and reform. Alexandra Washington returned to her federal office to find her inbox flooded with messages. Other court employees had begun coming forward, sharing their own documented instances of judicial misconduct. Mrs. Patterson's 15 years of meticulous notes had inspired others to reveal their records, creating a comprehensive picture of systemic bias that could no longer be ignored. The Judicial Qualifications Commission moved swiftly, announcing a comprehensive review of all municipal court practices. Director Marshall appointed a diverse panel of legal experts, community leaders, and civil rights attorneys to oversee the process. "What happened in Judge Henderson's courtroom," she announced to the press, "was a wake-up call. We're implementing mandatory bias training, regular audits of judicial decisions, and a new anonymous reporting system for court employees." Officer Thompson found himself appointed to a newly formed Court Officer Advisory Committee, and his years of silent observation finally gave voice in shaping policy. "We're the eyes and ears of the courthouse," he told his fellow officers. "From now on, we speak up when we see injustice." Sarah Chin, the law student, turned her courtroom notes into an article for the Law Review titled, "When Justice Faces Justice, the Role of Federal Oversight in Municipal Courts." Her professor used the case as a teaching tool, demonstrating how systematic documentation and strategic action could challenge entrenched systems of power. But perhaps the most profound change came from the ordinary citizens who'd witnessed that morning's events. The story spread through Atlanta's legal community, then beyond, becoming a symbol of hope for those who'd faced similar discrimination. People began requesting records of their past cases, looking for patterns, and speaking up about their experiences. Alexandra kept the $1,500 fine receipt framed on her office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that justice sometimes required standing firm in the face of authority. Below it, she placed a simple quote: "Change begins with documentation and ends with accountability." The Martinez trafficking case, momentarily delayed that historic morning, would go on to become one of the most significant prosecutions of the year. But Alexandra knew that what happened in that municipal courtroom had protected just as many lives, in its way, by challenging the subtle discriminations that eroded justice daily. 1 year later, Alexandra Washington stood at the podium in the same municipal courtroom, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a diverse group of newly appointed judges being sworn in as part of the court's comprehensive reform program. In the gallery sat Mrs. Patterson, now heading the Court Documentation Initiative, a program teaching court employees how to recognize and report discriminatory practices. Beside her, Officer Thompson beamed with pride. His Court Officer Advisory Committee had become a model for other jurisdictions across the state. Sarah Chin, now a civil rights attorney herself, watched from the back row where she'd witnessed history unfold a year ago. Her Law Review article sparked similar investigations in municipal courts throughout the Southeast, leading to a wave of reforms and resignations. Judge Henderson's old courtroom had been transformed, both physically and spiritually. Gone was the imposing throne-like chair he'd occupied. Instead, the bench was positioned closer to eye level with those seeking justice. A plaque on the wall read, "Justice sees no color, class, or creed. It only sees the truth." As Alexandra concluded her speech about the importance of vigilance and accountability in the justice system, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, the businessman, Mr. Davidson, who'd arrived late that fateful morning. He now served on the Citizens Oversight Committee, having learned firsthand the importance of speaking up against inequality. "Change," Alexandra told the assembled crowd, "doesn't always announce itself with thunderous declarations. Sometimes it arrives in quiet documentation, in careful observation, in the courage to stand up and say, "This isn't right." But most importantly, it lives in our daily commitment to ensure that justice truly is blind. The Martinez trafficking case files still sat on her desk at the federal courthouse, a reminder that the work of justice was never truly finished. But now, thanks to one morning of standing firm against discrimination, that work would be carried out in courts that were more fair, more accountable, and more just for everyone who sought their protection. As the ceremony concluded, Alexandra touched a small replica of her framed fine receipt that she now wore as a pendant, a reminder that sometimes the price of justice was worth every penny. That's how one federal prosecutor turned a simple parking ticket into a catalyst for systemic change in Atlanta's courts. Hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories about justice and accountability. Share if you believe in change.